The dial-up sound. That specific sound, the screech and squeal and static negotiation of two machines finding each other across a phone line. If you know exactly what that sounds like without needing to hear it, if it's already playing in your head right now, you belong to the last group of humans who will ever have a real memory of what the internet felt like before it was everywhere. You remember asking if anyone was using the phone before you connected. You remember the internet going dead because someone picked up the landline in the kitchen. You remember choosing your AIM screen name, the first identity you ever built for yourself online, and understanding even at 12 that what you picked would say something about who you were. You downloaded a song once that took 47 minutes, and you sat there and waited. Because there was no other way, and because whatever was coming down that phone line felt like access to a world that was still new enough to be genuinely exciting. You watched the internet go from a desk in one room of your house, a fixed location, a thing you visited, to something that lived in your pocket. You were there for the entire transition. You remember what before looked like. You watched the whole shift happen in real time, from inside it, during the years when your brain was still deciding who it was going to become. That experience, being the last generation to remember life without the internet, and the first to build an adult life inside it, is something no cohort before you had, and no cohort after you will ever have it, because for every generation born after 1996, the internet was simply always there. Psychology has been studying what that specific experience does to a person, and what it found is more particular than most people in this birth window have ever been told about themselves. If you were born between 1983 and 1996, you are one of the last people alive who will ever remember boredom the way it used to exist. Long, unstructured afternoons with nothing to fill them. Being genuinely unreachable between leaving school and walking in your front door. Having to figure something out slowly, through trial and error, through asking someone in person, through going to an actual library. The particular quality of silence that existed before a device in your pocket was always capable of interrupting it. You remember that, not as history, as a felt experience that still lives somewhere in your body. You also know what it feels like to build an entire professional and social life inside a digital world. To have your relationships run partly through screens. To look something up in 3 seconds that would have taken your parents 3 days. To feel the specific restlessness that arrives when the Wi-Fi drops and the portal closes. You hold both of those realities at the same time. You were trained by one world and reshaped by another. And the psychological result of that, living through a genuine transition instead of just reading about it, is something the research has only recently begun to fully describe. Developmental psychologists use the term cohort effect to describe how the conditions a generation passes through during their formative years leave a permanent structural mark on psychology, not just on preferences or habits, on the actual wiring of the brain. What is specific to the 1983 to 1996 cohort is that they underwent two fundamentally different developmental environments within a single lifetime. Their childhoods were built inside an analog framework, in-person connection as the default, delayed information, unstructured time with no guaranteed resolution, physical presence as the primary mode of human relationship. The brain built its foundational architecture, its sense of how social reality works, what boredom is for, what it means to be unreachable, inside that world. Then, during adolescence and early adulthood, that framework was replaced. Immediate access, permanent connectivity. The self is something that existed both in private and as a curated public presence online. Researchers call this process technological domestication, the way a society integrates a radical new tool until it restructures daily life entirely. What is unusual about this cohort is that they domesticated the internet during development, not after it. The technology and the identity formed together, simultaneously, without a template or a guidebook. No generation before them had done that. No generation after them will do it the same way, because for every cohort born after 1996, the integration was complete before consciousness fully began. In 1998, psychologist Robert Kraut and his colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University published a landmark paper in the American Psychologist titled Internet Paradox. They followed a group of early home internet adopters over 2 years, families bringing the internet into their homes for the first time in the mid-1990s. The finding was counterintuitive. A technology widely described as a social tool was producing measurable increases in loneliness and depression in its earliest users. More time online corresponded with weaker local social ties and lower psychological well-being. But Kraut's own follow-up study, published in 2002 in the same journal, showed something important. When the internet matured into something more genuinely connective, when it developed the social applications and community structures that came later, those effects reversed. The same technology, used differently, improved well-being and strengthened relationships. The 1983 to 1996 cohort lived through both phases. They were the original population Kraut's research was built on. They experienced the early internet's isolating period before the social web existed. Then they adapted as the technology changed. Then they adapted again when it went mobile. Then again when it became social media. That is a significant amount of continuous psychological recalibration to absorb across a single lifetime. And all of it happened during and immediately after the developmental years, when identity, emotional regulation, and social behavior are still being formed for the first time. Here is what that specific experience produced. You have something that neither the generation before you nor the generation after you possesses in the same form. You are genuinely fluent in the digital world. You grew up inside it, but you also carry a real, embodied understanding of what exists outside it, because you lived there first. You know the internet from the inside, and you know what preceded it from memory. You can put the phone down and remember how to be present, because you spent the first decade of your life with no other option. You know how to wait. You know how to be bored without immediately resolving it. You know what an afternoon without a plan and without stimulation actually feels like, and you can survive it in a way that most people who grew up after you simply cannot. That capacity is rarer than it sounds, and it is increasingly valuable in a world that has largely forgotten what it was for. You are also deeply nostalgic, not in a surface-level way, but in the specific way that comes from having actually lived through a world that no longer exists. A world where finding information took time, and therefore felt meaningful, where being unreachable was ordinary, and therefore not anxiety-producing, where logging on was a deliberate act, not a permanent condition. That nostalgia is not sentimentality. It is the accurate memory of something real that was replaced by something different during your own lifetime, without you being consulted about whether you wanted the trade. There is something worth saying about what it means to be the last to remember the before, the last generation to have built a core self inside a world that no longer exists as it was, the last who will ever carry both versions of reality, the analog and the digital, not as historical knowledge, but as genuine lived experience that still shapes how you move through the world. Every generation younger than you has grown up without the silence you knew at 10 years old. Every generation older than you stayed in the analog world and built their identities there. You are the specific, narrow cohort that stepped across the threshold as it was still being constructed, and who carries, because of that timing, something that no one else in human history carries in exactly the same form. You know what was lost, not abstractly, in your body, in your memory, in the specific texture of what an afternoon used to feel like before the world became permanently available. That is not a grievance, it is a form of witness. You are the generation that remembers both sides of the most significant transition in human history. And that memory, quiet, genuine, impossible to fully translate to anyone who wasn't there, is something you carry every time you put the phone down and feel, for a moment, completely like yourself. If this landed somewhere specific, subscribe. The next video goes into a part of this generation's psychology that most people have felt but never heard described out loud. If this one was accurate, the next one will be too.